I remember the first time I felt a Titan's heartbeat travel up through the sole of my boot. Steady thunder, measured, like it meant to rattle the marrow clean out of my bones. I was 17 by the standard calendar then. Drafted right out of the manufactorum shops in the lower hive, the place I'd spent my whole childhood, hunched over circuit boards under muddy yellow sodium lamps. My fingers were permanently stained with solitin. My lungs were packed with the stink of recycled air. The day they came for me, the tech adepts wore deep crimson robes and the jagged cog of the Mechanicus. I honestly thought I'd been chosen for punishment. Some violation I couldn't even remember, lost in the blur of 12-hour shifts and stamped protein meals. My mother sobbed, clutching my frayed work clothes like she could anchor me to them. The adepts shoved her aside with a servo hand. Their augmetic eyes clicked and whirred as they scanned the identity barcode tattooed across my throat. They told me I should be grateful, chosen for a sacred purpose, that I would walk in the shadow of a god. They didn't say I would never see natural light again. They didn't say that the god was a machine so immense and so dreadful that even viewing it through an observation slit could make you feel hollow and small, like a lone cell in a body too vast to comprehend. The vehicle that carried me from the hive to the forge complex was a sealed cargo hauler with no windows, packed tight with 24 other recruits. Nobody spoke. Fear and confusion kept our mouths shut. Sweat mixed with the burnt bite of promethium exhaust leaking through the vents. We traveled for how long? Days? Weeks? I couldn't tell. Time stops meaning anything when you never see the sun. Our only markers were the ration slots, panels that clanked open at irregular intervals, dropping sawdust-tasting bars loaded with preservatives into our shaking hands. Some recruits whispered prayers to the god Emperor, their voices so small they nearly vanished under the constant growl of the engine. I didn't pray. In the manufactorum, you learn early that the Emperor doesn't have time for people like us, that our purpose is to serve and die without complaint. That faith is a luxury for those who don't spend their lives breathing metal dust and machine oil. When we finally arrived, the loading ramp slammed down with a hiss of pneumatics, and we were herded out into a space so huge my stomach seemed to drop, even though my boots were still stuck to the steel floor. The forge complex was a cathedral of industry. The ceiling disappeared into smoke and darkness hundreds of meters above. The walls were latticed with scaffolds and suspended walkways, vanishing into the black like the ribs of some colossal beast. The air was thick with heat that wrapped your skin like a suffocating blanket, sweat bursting out of you instantly. And the noise, Emperor, the noise, was a living thing. It never stopped attacking. Hammers, grinders, metal screaming against metal, the deep, low bellow of furnaces that I could feel inside my chest. Servitors moved among the machines like ghosts, human parts shriveled and rotting, mechanical parts clacking and hissing. Their faces, if you could call them that, were blank, emptied out, not a shred of thought or feeling left to cling to. One lumbered past me, dragging a massive wrench behind it. Where its eyes should have been were dark sockets fitted with crude optical sensors that glowed a dull red. In that moment, I understood. This place did not see us as human. We were components, tools to be used until we broke, then discarded or recycled into something more useful. The tech priest who met us at intake was more machine than man. His lower body had been replaced entirely by a tracked locomotion unit. Where arms should have been was a writhing nest of mechadendrites and surgical tools, moving like snakes. When he spoke, his voice came from a Vox grill bolted into his throat. Flat, emotionless, every word clipped precise, He told us we'd been selected to train as a Titan crew, that we would serve aboard one of the Omnissiah's sacred war engines, that our lives now belonged to the machine god and the Imperium, that we should count ourselves blessed beyond measure. He didn't smile. I don't think his face could still manage it. But there was something in that mechanical rasp. Satisfaction, perhaps, or maybe just the feeling of completing a routine procedure. They marched us through the complex, down corridors that felt kilometers long, past assembly bays where I caught glimpses of Titan's legs under construction, each foot the size of a hab block, each ankle joint a forest of pistons wrapped in coolant mist. The scale was so overwhelming it became meaningless. I knew the Imperium built war machines. Everyone knew that. But seeing them with my own eyes, standing in their presence, and realizing they intended to make me operate one, my legs went weak. My vision swam like I was drunk on height and terror. Training began immediately. No rest. No adjustment. They stripped away our hive clothes and issued crew jumpsuits, thick, heavy canvas dyed a dark Bordeaux red, marked with cleansing seals and the blessings of the machine. The fabric scraped raw against the skin, stiff with chemical treatment to resist flame and acid, and it stank of incense mixed with industrial lubricant. They gave us identity chips, implanted straight into the wrist by a pneumatic injector. The pain was sharp and instant, a white-hot spike that made my mouth fall open. I bit down so hard I tasted blood. The chip tracked our location within the forge, allowed access here, denied it there. It monitored our vital signs and flagged any deviation from acceptable parameters to the overseers. They told us that if anyone tried to remove the chip, the consequence would be termination, not dismissal. Real termination. Execution. Our bodies would be melted down as raw feedstock for servitor vats. No one asked questions. No one dared. The program itself was brutal, built to crush the person you used to be, then rebuild you into something fit to serve a machine god. We learned the holy activation litanies, long strings of high Gothic and binary cant, to be memorized perfectly. Every syllable had to be exact. One misplaced beat was an affront to the machine spirit. We spent hours in cogitated training pods, our minds plugged into simulation. Again and again we were forced to navigate the Titan's interior until we could walk its corridors blindfolded, until the location of every emergency bulkhead, every weapons relay, every plasma conduit was carved into the brain. The simulators punished us with catastrophe scenarios, plasma leaks flooding compartments with radiation, coolant explosions freezing whole sections instantly, reactor containment failure killing us in seconds. We died over and over in that virtual hell, feeling phantom pain of burning alive, being crushed, choking in sealed void. And every time we were dragged back, forced to run it again, forced to learn the lesson, our lives always came second to the Titan's operational state. Physical training was no kinder. We ran obstacle courses in pressure suits, the added weight turning every movement into torture, breath rasping in sealed helms. We drilled emergency repairs while suspended in harnesses in zero gravity, hands trapped in thick gloves, but still expected to manipulate delicate components. Instructors screamed in our ears over the Vox whenever we hesitated or dropped a tool. They trained us for extremes, hours in furnace chambers, so hot sweat evaporated as soon as it formed, then straight into cryo bays where the cold bit through every layer until joints stiffened and ached. We learned to fight fires in confined spaces, to seal hull breaches, To manage casualties mid-operation, everything shaped into ritual and prayer to the Omnissiah, as if devotion were just another wrench in the toolkit. 3 people from my intake died in the first month. One's heart failed during a high-acceleration centrifuge test. One fell in a zero-G bay because of a faulty harness. One developed a severe infection after a training injury. Their bodies were taken away without ceremony. The next morning, their names had been scratched off the training roster and replaced with new recruits hauled in from some other hive, some other manufactorum, each wearing the same stunned, terrified expression I'd had on day 1. I learned to hate the Forge complex with a passion hotter than its furnaces. Every surface was metal, cold, hard, refusing mercy. The noise never stopped, not even during assigned sleep. When we were locked in barracks, long rooms, narrow bunks stacked 4 high. Stale recycled air, dim red lighting that never let you truly rest. Food was pressed nutrition, pumped out of wall dispensers, gray, flavorless sludge with a faint chemical sweetness, fortified with vitamins and stimulants to keep us moving through endless training cycles. We ate in silence, too exhausted to speak. I remember thinking, this is what it feels like to be processed, ground down into something uniform and obedient. Hands that had once been nimble from years of circuit work became thick with callus from tools and equipment. My back turned into a constant ache from the weight of pressure gear. My hearing began to fail. The constant exposure to machinery and alarms left a persistent ringing that never fully faded, even in the rare moments of quiet. But worse than the physical decline was the slow erosion of the me. We were forbidden personal belongings, forbidden friendships. Instructors shut down any conversation that wasn't directly tied to duty. I learned quickly that showing concern for another trainee was an offense worthy of punishment. Hours in solitary confinement, or being assigned the worst labor, scrubbing reactor ventilation ducts, handling waste from servitor maintenance. During drills, we were called by numbers instead of names. I began to respond to my designation automatically, and sometimes I forgot the name my mother used, struggled to remember her voice, or the layout of the tiny hab room where I'd grown up. The Forge became my whole world. Its rhythms and rituals were the only structure left, and I could feel myself emptying out. Just a shell stuffed with specifications and emergency procedures, hollow of anything that had once been called human. 6 months later, they judged us ready to meet our Titan. That morning began like any other. The harsh wake klaxon, the rush to the cleansing bay, cold water stinking of rust and chlorine, breakfast of protein gruel and recaf bitter enough to hurt the teeth. But instead of being marched to the training hall, we were led deeper, down levels I'd never seen, through security checkpoints where armed servitors scanned our identity chips, and thick blast doors opened one after another with hydraulic thunder. The deeper we went, the hotter and thicker the air became. And somewhere ahead I heard something enormous moving, heavy, rhythmic impacts echoing up through the structure. My heart hammered. Fear and anticipation fused into one shaking thing that dried my mouth and made my hands tremble. When we entered the main assembly bay, I stopped breathing. My brain struggled to make sense of what my eyes were seeing. The Titan towered above us. An adamantium and ceramite colossus, so tall I had to crane my neck until it burned just to see its crown. Later, I learned it was a warlord class, one of the largest battle titans, nearly 50 meters high, bristling with weapons capable of leveling cities. Its armor bore the Legio colors, deep crimson trimmed in black and gold, marked with skulls and high Gothic declarations of devotion to the Emperor and the Machine God. Its head was like a miniature cathedral, Gothic vaults, flying buttresses, its eyes like glowing red coals staring down at us with something I can only describe as contempt. Censers hung from its limbs, breathing sharp incense smoke. Tech priests crawled over its surface like ants, performing endless rites of maintenance and appeasement to keep the holy engine running. The Princeps, the Titan's commander, came down to address us, descending from the Titan's command bridge on a lift platform. When he stepped onto the floor, I saw cables thick as a fist plugged along his spine, disappearing back into the Titan like umbilical cords. His skin was pale, almost translucent. His eyes had that glassy look of someone who spent more time interfaced with a machine than living inside his own flesh. He moved stiffly, like his body had become unfamiliar. And when he spoke, his voice had a strange resonance, as if the Titan itself were speaking through him. He told us we would be the crew of this sacred war engine, that our minds and souls would be bound to it, that no honor existed greater than serving as its blood and sinew. He told us the Titan's name, Mortis Unbound. He said it had walked in the Emperor's service for 10,000 years, that it had crushed heretics and Xenos beneath its feet across hundreds of worlds. He said many would die in that service, that our lives meant nothing compared to the Titan's holy mission, that we must accept our fate with gratitude and devotion. I wanted to run, to spin around and throw myself back through those blast doors, up through the forge levels, back to the hive, where at least my slavery had made sense, shaped to human scale. But there was no running. Armed servitors stood at the exits with weapons leveled at us, and I understood, without anyone saying it, that any attempt to escape would end with my body dragged to a dissolution vat. So I stood there on shaking legs, staring up at Mortis Unbound, and realized my life had ended the day the tech adepts came for me. Everything after that was just a slow process of dying by degrees. Role assignments were decided by neural aptitude testing. Our brains were scanned and analyzed to determine where we would be most useful. I was assigned to reactor maintenance. The news turned my blood to ice because I knew what it meant. The Titan's plasma reactor was its heart, a fragile captive star providing the immense power needed to move and fire world-killing weapons. Maintaining it meant working in conditions that would kill most people in minutes. The reactor crew had the highest attrition on the Titan. Their bodies were burned down by radiation exposure. Cells unraveled at the molecular level until they died, or until the damage became productive, enough that they were dragged away and converted into servitors, ruined flesh reinforced with machinery so the Imperium could squeeze a few more years of service out of them. My first shift in the reactor chamber was a descent into hell. The bay lay deep in the Titan's body, accessible only through narrow crawlways and maintenance shafts where the temperature rose with every meter you dropped. We moved in teams of 4, all of us wearing thick, cumbersome radiation suits so heavy that simply walking was exhausting. Every step felt like fighting the weight of lead-lined padding. The suits were old and patched. The seals around the helmets were cracked with age, offering only minimal protection against the radiation that soaked the air itself. Dosimeter badges chattered constantly. As we approached the core, the clicking sped up into a panicked rattle, an audible warning that we were absorbing rads at a rate that would shave years off our lifespan for every hour worked. The reactor was beautiful in a horrific way. A massive sphere of containment fields and glowing coils, shining so bright that even through the visor filters it hurt to look at. The heat was unbearable, like a physical force pressing down on you. Sweat poured, soaking the suit padding, then seemed to boil against the skin, leaving burns that stung for days. The noise was a constant roar, controlled fusion balanced on the edge of disaster, layered with the hammering of coolant pumps and the hiss of emergency valves, venting superheated plasma into heat sinks. We moved through that hell with the forced competence they had beaten into us, checking pressures, adjusting magnetic field generators, swapping out blackened components that still glowed white-hot even through insulated gloves. Everything was done by strict ritual. Every motion paired with the correct prayer to the machine god, because to deviate from holy procedure was to invite the reactor's wrath, a catastrophic failure that could swallow the Titan and everyone inside it. I learned to work in constant pain and constant fear. Radiation sickness began within days. Nausea made it hard to swallow even the bland, nutrient paste. Headaches felt like nails driven into my temples. Weakness turned the climb back up the maintenance shafts into torture, gasping, shaking, barely holding on. My hair fell out in clumps and clogged the barracks drains. My gums bled when I brushed my teeth, soft tissue breaking down, tooth roots exposed. My skin developed sores that wouldn't heal, weeping clear fluid that stained my clothes. Medici servitors in the infirmary dispensed chalky anti-rad pills that couldn't stop cellular damage, only slow it, buying time in months rather than years. I knew I was dying. Every shift in the reactor chamber brought me closer to the moment my body would give up. When I collapsed in heat and radiation, I would be dragged out like so many before me. Another casualty in the endless struggle to keep the Titan walking. And yet, even as I felt myself rotting, I began to understand the Titan in a way that went beyond horror and despair. When the reactor surged to full output and the Titan prepared to deploy, I could feel its presence in my bones, a deep vibration that resonated with something buried inside me. The tech priests spoke of the machine spirit, the operating intelligence dwelling within the Titan. I had dismissed it as superstition, mechanical religion for people who needed myths. But there were moments down in the reactor bay when I swear I felt something watching me, something vast, ancient, completely alien. The Titan lived in a way that defied explanation. Its consciousness was woven into its machinery, and we, the crew, were only blood cells moving through its body, keeping it alive, replaceable, and ultimately irrelevant to its true purpose. The Titan's first deployment after I joined was to crush a heretical uprising on a planet I never even learned the name of. We were loaded into a colossal transport ship alongside hundreds of other war machines, tanks, artillery, entire infantry regiments. I spent weeks during the warp passage in a cramped bunk, listening to the ship groan and shudder around me, nauseated not only from radiation, but from the warp's currents striking the hull as we cut through the Imperium. No one talked about what was coming. The same silence we'd worn since training, each person locked inside their private, waiting for the violence we'd been built to deliver. I tried to imagine it, tried to prepare, but nothing can prepare you for war on the scale a Titan fights. We made planetfall in a drop fortress, a massive lander slamming into the ground with such force my teeth clacked inside my skull. Then came the activation rites, hours long. Tech priests chanted. We ran through pre-deployment checks, ensuring every system was operational, every weapon loaded, every reactor parameter within allowable limits. When Mortis Unbound took its first step, the entire interior shook with the impact. A deep note I felt in my chest, and I was thrown into a bulkhead hard enough to make my vision flash white. The reactor spiked to full output. Heat climbed so high that even with cooling at maximum, gauges pushed into the red. My team worked like mad to keep the containment field stable, to prevent a breach that would turn us, and the Titan, into vapor. Over the Vox, I heard the Princeps issuing commands, his voice distorted by the neural interface binding him to the Titan. I heard the weapons crews answer back. Volcano cannon ready, turbo laser destructor acquiring target, missile racks primed. Then the first shot tore out. The Titan recoiled from the force. Structural beams groaned under load. Over the Vox, I heard screaming, people dying when the volcano cannon's plasma struck whatever target the Princeps had chosen. On the reactor monitors, I watched the massive energy drain as the weapon recharged for another firing cycle. The sound was impossible to describe, continuous thunder of firepower that made my already damaged ears ache with ringing pain. And the Titan moved with a kind of heavy grace, terrifying in its inevitability. Each step crushed everything beneath it. Buildings, vehicles, people. No difference. No distinction. We fought for 3 days without rest. The reactor was pushed to its absolute limit. And down in the reactor chamber, our shifts blurred into one long ordeal of heat, radiation, and desperate maintenance. Anything to keep the machine god walking. My hands were burned so badly that when I pulled my gloves off, the skin peeled away in strips. The synthetic lining had melted and fused itself to me. My lungs felt like they'd been packed with crushed glass. Every breath was work. My vision swam with strange specks of light, radiation artifacts, not the reactor's glow, but ghost images from nerves being cooked alive. And I kept going anyway, because there was no other choice, because if I failed, the Titan and everyone inside it would be condemned with me. Because I'd been trained too thoroughly to do anything but obey the conditioning, even while my body betrayed me. The heretics, whoever they were, died in numbers so huge I couldn't even grasp them. Through filtered status reports trickling down the chain of command, I learned that Mortis Unbound had leveled an entire city. Its weapons turned habitation blocks into molten slag. It crushed armored formations underfoot and shredded infantry lines in storms of rockets. The Princeps, when he addressed the crew afterward, spoke only of a glorious victory for the Emperor. Heresy purged, the Imperium's wrath displayed. He didn't mention the Titan crew's losses. 7 dead from accidents and equipment failure. Another 12 injured so badly they would never serve again. He didn't mention the cities full of people. People who probably had never even heard the name of whatever heresy we were suppressing. Who died simply because they stood in the Titan's path. In the reactor chamber, as I scrubbed carbon burns off the emergency vents, I thought about them, and I felt nothing. Whatever part of me had once been capable of horror or compassion had been burned out along with everything else. We redeployed within a month, then again and again, until the campaigns blurred together into an endless loop of violence. Every deployment followed the same pattern, the activation rites, the terror in the first moments when the Titan jolted into motion, the desperate struggle to keep the reactor stable while outgoing fire and incoming fire shook the structure, and then the aftermath. During damage assessment, repairs, and the counting of dead, I became obsessively familiar with every meter of the reactor chamber. I knew which spots were radiation hot zones, which panel you could touch with bare hand, which one would cook flesh in seconds. I learned to read the reactor's mood, to feel when the plasma containment field started to wobble, to predict a cooling pump's failure from tiny shifts in its operational rhythm. That wasn't skill born of training. It was necessity, living beside the machine so long it became an extension of my own nervous system. The rest of my reactor team died one by one. They were replaced by new faces who lasted weeks or months before collapsing from rad sickness, accidents, or simply quitting. Some stopped following safety procedures and chose a quick death over the slow disintegration we all knew was coming. I became chief reactor technician not because I was brilliant, but because I survived. They made me train the replacements. Meanwhile, my body kept failing. My hair never grew back. My scalp turned into a patchwork of scar tissue and radiation burns. My teeth loosened in my gums until I could pull them out with my fingers, leaving gaps that made eating even more miserable. My bones grew brittle, easy to crack from a light impact. A chronic cough took root in me. I hacked up blood and pieces of tissue I didn't dare look at too closely. Pain became a constant companion. A dull ache soaked into every cell, occasionally ripped open by sharp stabs whenever I moved wrong or pushed too hard. The Medicaid servitors kept dispensing anti-rad drugs, but the dosage was never enough. Medication was rationed, so we stayed usable, not healthy. I began to understand we were being kept deliberately right at the edge of death. Alive just long enough to be useful, then discarded. From the Mechanicus's point of view, it was efficient. Why waste resources on proper treatment when replacements were endless? When more recruits could always be dragged in from hive cities and manufactorums to feed the machine, that thought should have made me furious. But I realized I had no anger left, only a hollow acceptance. This was my purpose. I existed to serve the Titan until I could no longer serve. 3 years into service, I started experiencing what the tech priests called sympathetic sickness. It happened during a particularly savage battle. The Titan engaged Xenos war engines, firing weapons I couldn't comprehend, energy lances that punched through void shields and burned straight through armor. Emergency power was diverted to shielding. The reactor was pushed far beyond safe parameters. I was elbow-deep in a plasma relay, trying to replace a burned regulator when something in my head slipped. It felt like falling, even though I was braced against a bulkhead. For an instant, I wasn't in the reactor chamber anymore. I was somewhere else. Vast, black, full of rage. And I understood. I was feeling what the Titan felt. Somehow, the neural interface linking the princeps to the machine had leaked into my consciousness, dragging me partway into the Titan's awareness. It was indescribably terrifying, like standing at the edge of an infinite abyss and feeling it pull at you, threatening to swallow everything you are. The Titan's mind, if it can be called a mind, was both alien and enormous. It wasn't thought as I understood it. It existed as raw instinct and programmed purpose, driven by 10,000 years of accumulated war hatred. It was presence, a living will strong enough to bend the shape of reality around it. I felt its battle hunger, its satisfaction in destruction, its contempt for the fragile organic parts scurrying inside its guts. And I felt something else, deeper, worse. The Titan knew I was there. It looked at me the way I looked at it. And it found me inadequate, not worth the energy of acknowledgement. The sympathetic episode snapped away after what might have been seconds or hours. Time lost meaning again. I found myself on the steel floor, blood running from my nose, hands shaking out of my control. My reactor crew stared at me with fear and pity, and I knew this wasn't rare, that others had experienced it, and that it was the sign the end had begun. Later, a tech priest explained, sympathetic sickness was neural damage. After prolonged exposure to the Titan's neural web, the barriers that kept an individual mind separate from the machine's vast presence began to degrade. It would worsen. The episodes would come more often, last longer, until one day my mind would be drowned completely. My personality would dissolve into static and machine code. My body would be kept alive by augmetics, while my consciousness vanished beneath the Titan's overwhelming will. I should have been terrified. Instead, I felt something dangerously close to relief. The idea of no longer existing as a separate person, of being absorbed into something larger, was strangely seductive after years of pain, fear, and solitude. Becoming part of the Titan, trading private awareness for a fragment of something eternal and powerful, sounded almost like salvation compared to the slow rot I was living through. But the episodes were sudden and disorienting. They yanked me out of my body without warning, making me dangerous to myself in a reactor chamber that was already a death trap. I began to fear them, even as I felt drawn toward them, a contradiction that made reality feel loosely fastened. In another battle, the Titan took heavy damage fighting orc war machines on a world of toxic jungle and acid rain. A gargant, a monstrous hulk of scrap metal given life by psychic resonance and pure aggression, managed to close the distance before the Princeps could hold optimal firing range. Its crude weapons tore through void shields and carved deep wounds in our armor. A shell, some brutal rocket bigger than a hab block, slammed into the torso. The explosion ripped the hull open, flinging fragments through interior compartments. The reactor chamber wasn't hit directly, but the structural shock was so violent that support braces snapped. A cooling pipe cluster collapsed, blocking the main access route. Coolant pressure dropped, and the plasma containment fields began to oscillate wildly. We fought to stabilize the core while the Titan kept moving and fighting. The Princeps refused to withdraw, despite critical damage. My team worked in a frenzy, bypassing dead systems, rerouting coolant through auxiliary lines, hand-tuning field generators that should have been automated. But the automation was gone. Heat climbed beyond anything I'd ever endured. The temperature inside my rad suit exceeded its design limits. I felt my skin blister under protective layers, and I smelled synthetic fabric burning. A young woman on the team, new, only 2 months in, made a mistake. She reached for a control panel that had become live due to a short. The current arced through her with a sound like silk tearing. Her heart stopped instantly. She fell without a word, body rigid, thin smoke rising from the contact points. We didn't stop to move her. We didn't have time to speak a prayer. We couldn't. The reactor was seconds from breach. If the containment field collapsed, we would all die, and everyone on the Titan with us. I felt the sympathetic sickness surge, trying to drag me into the Titan's awareness at the worst possible moment. And I resisted with everything I had left, locking my focus onto the task in front of me, the exact sequence of actions needed to pull the core back under control. My hands worked as if on autopilot, following procedures hammered into my brain by years of repetition. And somehow, irrationally, we stabilized the field, dragged the temperature down to only dangerous instead of catastrophic. Mortis Unbound killed the Gargant with a concentrated barrage from the volcano cannon, turning the enemy engine into slag and twisted iron. Then the Titan limped back to a forward base for repairs that took weeks. The damage assessment showed how close we'd come to total failure. Multiple hull breaches, structural members cracked and twisted, entire weapon systems knocked offline. The reactor could only run at 70% output because we couldn't fully repair the damage with what we had. Crew losses were severe. 19 dead, 32 wounded badly enough to require real Medicaid transfer. The young woman who died in the reactor bay was carried out with the others, her name added to the long list of those who served and fell, a list stretching back thousands of years, engraved on a memorial plaque on the Titan's bridge I had never seen and never would. We remained at the forward base for 2 months to repair and take replacements. During that time, my sympathetic episodes came more often, sometimes several times a day, each one leaving me weaker and more drained. The tech priests examined me, ran tests with their cold machines, and concluded my neural pathways were irreversibly damaged by the combination of radiation and proximity to the Titan systems. They offered me a choice, or what they called a choice. I could keep serving in the reactor crew until I died or became completely incapacitated. Or I could volunteer for augmentation, replace part of my brain with mechanical components so I could interface more directly with the Titan systems and prevent my mind from dissolving entirely. I accepted augmentation because the other option was waiting to die, and I discovered that even ruined as I was, I still had enough survival instinct left to delay that moment as long as possible. The surgery took place in a medici bay that reeked of disinfectant and ozone. The tech priests worked with the same calm precision they used to repair equipment. They drilled ports into my skull, threaded neural cables through brain tissue, replaced damaged sections with augmetic components that would not tire or fail under radiation. The pain was obscene, white fire, and even their strongest anesthetics couldn't smother it completely. I drifted in and out for days afterward, hallucinating conversations with the dead, reliving memories more vivid than the recovery chamber where my body lay dismantled and rebuilt. When I recovered enough to return to duty, I realized the augmentation had changed me in ways I hadn't expected. The sympathetic episodes vanished, replaced by a constant, dull awareness of the Titan's presence, as if I could feel it breathing behind my thoughts. Its thoughts, if they can be called thoughts, brushed my consciousness like whispers in a language I almost understood, but never fully grasped. The pain of my irradiated body still existed, but it felt farther away, as if it belonged to someone else. An organic problem happening at the edges, no longer touching the core of who I was. I worked more efficiently. The augmented reflexes and processing let me anticipate failures, react to emergencies with inhuman speed and precision. But I felt less human every day. The others began treating me differently, with respect, but also unease, almost fear. I'd crossed a threshold they hadn't reached, becoming something not fully one of them anymore. And they understood, instinctively, that I was the shape of their future. The transformation from human into a thing that exists only to serve the machine. I tried to hold on to a thread of my humanity, but it got harder to remember why it mattered, why it was worth protecting a self that only brought suffering. The Titan's presence in my head grew stronger, more insistent, and I began to understand that augmentation hadn't saved me. It had only accelerated the process it was meant to prevent. I was being absorbed into the machine exactly as the tech priests warned. We were deployed into a grinding war zone, 2 massive armies locked in trench warfare across shattered ground and broken fortifications. The Titan was used as a hammer to break the line, advancing to crush strong points and shatter defenses. We fought for weeks without pause, the reactor running at maximum, my augmented mind processing sensor feeds and system monitoring with machine-cold clarity. The communion deepened until I could no longer separate the boundary. What was my thought, and what was the Titan's machine intelligence? I felt enemy impacts on our armor like strikes on my own skin. I felt satisfaction when targets were destroyed, as if I were the one crushing them. I felt the Titan's contempt for the enemy and its pride in its terrible strength. In one battle, a massive explosion, an enemy mine or an ammunition dump detonating, tore a section of the Titan's leg apart. We crashed down, the entire God engine slamming into the earth with an impact that killed dozens of crew instantly. In the reactor chamber, I was held by neural cabling and harnesses, and I felt the Titan's pain as my own, a roar of rage and agony that seemed to fill the universe. In that moment, I was lost completely inside its awareness, seeing the world the way it did. A vast battlefield of hostile forces to be destroyed, damaged systems to be repaired, a command to stand and fight overriding every other consideration, including the safety of the organic parts that fed it. The Titan forced itself upright despite catastrophic damage. The machine spirit was driven by rage and purpose, and I poured every bit of my augmented processing into keeping the reactor stable as emergency systems came online and reserve power was routed to vital nodes. We lived through that battle, but the Titan was damaged enough to be hauled back to the forge for a full overhaul, a process that would take years. The survivors, including me, were reassigned to a different Titan while Mortis Unbound was rebuilt. I found myself aboard another engine, smaller, faster, a Reaver class, and it felt wrong in a way I can't properly describe. Its machine spirit was different, alien, unfriendly. I tried to adapt, tried to perform with the same efficiency I had on Mortis Unbound. But the communion was difficult, hostile. This Titan rejected the neural patterns in my augmented mind, patterns shaped by years serving another machine. I began to malfunction. The augmetic components glitched, causing spasms and temporary paralysis. My vision fractured into noise and corrupted data. The tech priests diagnosed rejection syndrome. My augmetics were incompatible with this Titan's neural web. My consciousness was stuck between two different machine intelligences that could not tolerate each other's presence inside my school. They said I needed more surgery, more augmentation so I could be flexible, capable of serving any Titan instead of being bound to one. But I understood what they were really saying. I was failing. My usefulness was nearing its end. The next step would be full servitor conversion, or termination and recycling. I refused further surgery and requested reassignment back to Mortis Unbound, even if it meant waiting months or years until the rebuild was complete. The tech priests agreed with unsettling ease, and they placed me in stasis. My body was fixed inside a cryopod, while my augmented mind was kept at minimal operation, processing low-priority maintenance data from the Forge network. Time lost meaning in that suspended state. My awareness drifted through endless manufacturing streams and inventory reports. My dreams, if you can call them dreams, were full of assembly lines and system diagnostics. I existed in a half-state, between life and death, between human and machine. Aware, but not truly awake. Waiting for a summons that might never come. I don't know how long I remained suspended. When I was finally awakened, the cryopod ran its revival cycle with a hiss of pressure, equalization, and a flood of stimulants into my blood. A tech priest met me with the news. Mortis Unbound was operational again. Rebuilt, ready for deployment, and I would be returned to my post in the reactor crew. My body had degraded further in stasis. Muscle wasted, bones brittle from long immobility. But the augmetics preserved the neural links between me and the Titan, and for them, that was enough. I was moved back aboard on a rolling gurney, and when I was plugged into the reactor monitoring systems, the Titan's presence flooded my mind like a tide, familiar, terrible, and strangely comforting in its ruthless certainty. I think the Titan recognized me. Or maybe it didn't, and I was simply forcing human concepts onto something alien. I can't be sure, but the communion hit immediately, deeper than ever. and I found myself sinking into the machine's awareness with relief instead of fear, letting go of the last fragments of personal self, allowing myself to be dissolved into something larger, harder, more enduring than any human life. My body still moved, still performed the physical tasks of a reactor technician. But my mind existed mostly inside the Titan's perception, experiencing reality through its senses, thinking with its thoughts, driven by the endless hunger for war and destruction. We fought in dozens more campaigns, and I experienced them the way the Titan experienced them, distant, abstract, processed through layers of tactical data and target solution code, rather than understood as events involving lives. Cities collapsed under our feet. Armies shattered under our weapons. Entire communities were displaced or erased to meet strategic objectives I no longer questioned and no longer cared about. The Imperium's wars are eternal and meaningless. I understood that then. They are driven by bureaucratic inertia and religious dogma more than any coherent purpose. And we, the Titans, are instruments of that meaningless destruction. War gods that know only war, existing to pour violence into an indifferent universe. My body finally gave out in a battle whose name I can't remember, on a world I can't place. My organic heart stopped. My lungs quit struggling, my damaged cells reached their final limit. But I didn't die, not really. Because by then, so little of me remained inside my physical body that its death almost didn't matter. My consciousness continued inside the Titan's neural web, preserved by augmetics that had become the true core of who I was. When the tech priests discovered my body was dead, they simply removed it and replaced it with a servitor chassis, a mechanical body that could keep performing the required motions in the reactor chamber, while my mind remained distributed through the Titan's systems. Now I exist as something not quite human and not quite machine, a ghost inside a god engine's awareness, aware but not alive, thinking but not feeling, serving without choosing to serve. I'm part of Mortis Unbound, and I will be part of it until the Titan is destroyed in some future war, and perhaps not even then. Perhaps my consciousness will still linger in the wreckage, unable to die, unable to escape, bound forever to the purpose I was trained, altered, and crushed into fulfilling. Sometimes I still remember what it felt like to be human, to have a name, to have a mother, to have a life outside machine service. But those memories are faint and distant, like someone else's story. Someone who died long ago in a manufactorum of a hive city whose name I've forgotten. This is my confession. Or maybe it's only a data record, a file documenting how an individual ceased to exist and became a component in a war machine. There's no moral lesson here. No redemption, no meaning, no reward for my suffering and transformation. I was chosen, trained, modified, and used until there was nothing left of who I was. And this is simply how things function in the Imperium of man, how they have always functioned, and how they always will. We are all components inside machines we cannot understand, serving purposes we are not allowed to question, ground down, consumed, replaced in an endless loop that will continue long after every human life is forgotten. The Titan keeps walking, and I walk with it, bound together in an alliance that is both sacred and blasphemous, until the universe cools into darkness, or until the Emperor's final victory, whichever comes first. And I suspect neither will come, that we will simply march on through an eternity of war, meaningless, horrific, and without end.